Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director, and with me is our favorite bishop, Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome.
I appreciate that. I'm glad to be your favorite bishop.
I'm trying to give you creative intros, and I'm running low on material.
I appreciate that.
Hey, today we're going to be talking about what I think is your most important book, and that's saying something. You've written about a dozen, but it's called The Priority of Christ Toward a Postliberal Catholicism. Now, the book was originally published in 2007 by Baker Academic, but it was just re-released, a new second edition, just about a week ago, and it's now in a beautiful hardcover edition. The first edition was just a paperback book, but there's a beautiful new hardcover edition, so it's kind of being reintroduced to the world. And so we wanted to spend some time looking at some of the major themes in this book. So let's start off by asking some basic questions. Priority of Christ. Why did you originally write this book? Where did it come from? What's it seeking to do?
Yeah, I remember very vividly where I was, the conditions when I began this book. It was in 2002, and I went to the University of Notre Dame on a sabbatical, and I taught a little bit when I was there. But my purpose really was to write this book, and I intended it as a big, serious academic book. I've written books in a lot of different registers, some much more popular, some kind of middle brow, but I've written a number of books that are high academic. Well, this is one that I wanted to gather in the most serious way what I was thinking about. And what I was thinking about increasingly was the influence of liberalism on theology. Now, let me just, as best I can, define that admittedly slippery term. When I say liberal, I mean a view, an approach to theology that comes up out of the modern period, that puts a huge stress on the primacy of subjectivity and human experience. So reading Revelation through the lens of human experience. The deepest roots of all this go back to people like René Descartes, right, who said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And then from the standpoint of that experience of the cogito, read all of reality. So he reaffirms the world and God and everything else, but does so through the lens or at the adjudicating bar of subjectivity. Now, almost all of modern philosophy follows Descartes. You see it in Kant, where the a priori ideas in the mind determine what we know and how we know. Think of Hegel, who in some ways apotheosizes the Cartesian subject, turns the Cartesian subject into God. Absolute spirit coming to know itself through finite spirit, etc. All of that is the tone of modern philosophy. Now, modern philosophy then massively influenced modern theology. Now, someone like Friedrich Schleiermacher, usually regarded as the father of modern liberalism in theology, would read all of Revelation through the lens of the experience of absolute dependency. Again, human experience coming first, doctrine being read through that lens. Schleiermacher is imitated by a whole army of people. Think of Paul Tillich in the 20th century. Think of Karl Rahner on the Catholic side. It's very interesting. Rahner's great book is called in German Grundkurs des Glaubens, which means a fundamental course in belief. Well, see, the German-speaking world would have caught a reference there to Schleiermacher's great book, which is called Glaubenslehre, which means a teaching about belief. See, rather than dogmatique, most Germans, when they wrote dogmatic theology, dogmatique, Schleiermacher said, no, I'm going to write a Glaubenslehre. And so Rahner, who's in many ways a Catholic Schleiermacher, writes a Grundkurs des Glaubens and not a dogmatique. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit technical here, but it's all making the point that it's human experience that is the way in and the adjudicating bar for theology. What I was proposing was an overturning of that.
Cardinal Francis George, your great mentor, wrote the foreword for the original edition of the book, and I think he pithily sums up the issue you're seeking to correct here. He says that the original sin of liberal Christianity is to reduce divine self-revelation to personal religious experience. Does that kind of capture the gist of what you're overturning?
That's in one line what I was just saying now. It's kind of a longer compass, to give the background. But yeah, now, mind you, I understand the Cartesian instinct. I understand the Schleiermacherian instinct and Tillich and Rahner. It's to make religion more accessible to modern people who are more at home with things like experience. Look, go from Schleiermacher and Rahner, these high figures, to someone like Oprah. What's the appeal that's always being made today? Well, to your own spiritual experience, right? So that was the instinct, was to begin with that and then try to interpret Revelation in light of it, so as to make Revelation, now here's the term from my youth, relevant to people today. Well, what's the strategy? Start with experience, see? So I get it. And furthermore, I think, there's something to it. I think there is a feeling of absolute dependency. I think Schleiermacher's right. I think Descartes' right when he says cogito ergo sum. I think Kant is right when he says there are certain a priori structures that make knowing possible. But it's how fully you press on that, how completely you make that your hermeneutical key, that becomes the mark of liberalism. So see, I'm urging not an anti-liberal theology, but a post-liberal theology that acknowledges, because in some ways, how can you not? How can you just put your head in the sand? That acknowledges the legitimate achievements of liberalism, but then tries to go beyond it to something fresh.
I probably should have done this at the beginning. It's always good to start by defining your terms. And one of the major terms here is liberalism. I remember when I first heard the word liberalism in a theology class, I thought, that's what Democrats think about God. But that's not what you mean by liberalism. So tell us what theological liberalism means.
Well, and I have been. That's what it's the beginning with experience. It's giving primacy to the subjective experience of the divine, and then reading Revelation from that standpoint. So you might call it a subjectivism, a modernism, and again, I would define modernism in a Cartesian way. It's this turn to subjectivity, giving epistemological primacy to subjective experience. You might say that's my definition here of liberalism. So it's not a political term. I'm not talking about, as you suggest, what the Democratic Party feels about taxes or something. It's a technical term that's borrowed really from the Cartesian shift that happened in the 16th and 17th centuries.
So at the beginning of the book, The Priority of Christ, you kind of outline the problems of theological liberalism, and you suggest that what this liberalism looks like on the ground, sort of when this philosophy of theological liberalism takes hold and drips down to, say, the parish level, the result is what you describe as beige Catholicism. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and I was using that term long before I wrote this book. In some ways, this book is the attempt fully to articulate what I mean by that. So I used that term in my earliest writings when I got back from my doctoral studies. I talked about beige Catholicism. What I mean, of course, is a Catholicism that's lost its distinctive quality, that's lost its edge, that's allowed all of its distinctive colors to bleed into a bland background. A Catholicism that mimics the culture more than challenges the culture. A sort of fit in, get along, aren't we all the same deep down Catholicism? The kind that I got as a kid. So I came of age right after Vatican II, and I got this very bland, get along, aren't we all saying the same thing Catholicism. And that led to all sorts of distortions and problems. So my book was meant to be something like, I suppose, what Karl Barth was doing in the early 20th century, to try to blow the liberalism of his time out of the water. I was trying to do something similar, like to shake up the, I think, way too complacent, bland liberalism that had invaded the Catholic Church.
So you begin with this problem of liberalism, and then you propose Jesus as the answer, putting the focus back on Jesus, making him the priority. And you extrapolate that into these different areas of thinking. One is epistemology, so the study of knowing, of knowledge. Another is metaphysics, the study of being or existence. And then finally, ethics, how we behave, what's good and what's bad. So let's spend some time on each of those. So what does it look like to make Christ the priority instead of the culture or instead of our experiences in the realm of epistemology? In what ways do Christians know and seek knowledge differently than the rest of the culture does?
Well, let me get to epistemology, but let me say something first about Jesus. One of the things you'll find in a lot of the postmodern, post-liberal writers is this issue of positioning. And what that means is, whenever you're talking about something, there's always some reality or some assumption that's in the positioning relationship. That's to say, things are read from the standpoint of that. I often use this military analogy. I hinted at it earlier. Robert E. Lee's genius was, and the reason he won so many battles, even though he was greatly outnumbered in the early years of the Civil War, is Lee seized the high ground. He always got to the battleground first, seized it, and then set the terms of the battle. And so once he dug in the high ground, the Union just kept charging up, and Lee's troops mowed them down. And Lee won battle after battle because he got the high ground. He set the tone for the debate. He positioned the battle, see? Very often, who positions things wins. Liberalism is a placing of human experience and subjectivity in the positioning stance. And then Christian revelation comes charging up that hill and has to make itself credible to that perspective. What I was suggesting was, no, Jesus, who is not one figure among many, not just one teacher among many, but as St. John says, is the Logos itself. He's divine reason itself. Look in Colossians, where Jesus has this absolutely central position. In him, all things exist. All things obtain in him. All things were made for him. See, what's being claimed there, it's something epistemological, that he belongs in the positioning relationship, and he can't be read from a point of vantage outside of himself. See, who sets up the battle usually wins. Who sets up the argument usually wins, right? And what I'm complaining about is that for so long, human experience, this general religious sensibility, has set up the terms of the argument, which is why Christianity has been bled of so many of its distinctive colors, and why Jesus, in fact, has become, in the minds of many, one figure among many. That's, of course, what he becomes once you've set up liberal assumptions. So my book was meant to challenge all of that and to say, I don't think it's the least bit self-evident that human subjectivity belongs in the positioning relationship. In fact, it's repugnant to the implicit logic of the Bible, as I've been laying out now. All of that radicality, all that dynamite, I wanted to become clear in the book.
So then getting down into the epistemological question, how do Christians distinctively make Christ the foundation of their knowledge?
Well, think of like a Cartesian epistemology, which is based on the cogito, or a Kantian epistemology based on a priori notions. If Christians say Jesus is the Logos, and that Logos has been made flesh, and he shows up, he looks like something, we can see him move and operate. Well, that's the Logos, which has already seized the mind when it goes about the business of knowing. Therefore, we know in a very distinctive way, and we would claim it's the correct way to know. Well, what is the nature of the Logos? The Logos, we find out through the narratives of the New Testament, is love. God is love. That's the story being told through Jesus. The Logos by which all things were made, right? Because all things came to be through him, have come to be through an act of love. And therefore, and I don't mean this in a sentimental way, it's careful to make that distinction. Love plays a key role in epistemology and how we know. Now, let me make a little contrast because I know it's getting kind of abstract. Think of modern knowing. Beginning with subjectivity, which has a regnant position, right? It's in the king's throne. From that position, Descartes said, the point of philosophy is to master nature. Well, welcome to modern science in many ways, right? That we go out aggressively to master and control nature. Think of a lot of modern technology and what it's done to the world. It's an epistemology from the standpoint of human mastery. But what if you say, no, love is the primary reality, and love is the mode by which we know? Well, then we're going to go out in a very different spirit. We're going to meet the world in a very different way, namely a sort of epistemology of coherence. And here I'm going to get some little deep waters because I follow Thomas Aquinas' epistemology, where Thomas talks a lot about the interpenetration of knower and known. Do you know what I'm saying? The known is not there just to be mastered by me, dissected, taken apart, understood in an analytical, aggressive way. But rather, I come to know the object through a sort of sympathetic entry into its dynamics and a sort of mutuality whereby the object, as it were, knows me. Now, to get into all those details, read the book of how you find that in Thomas Aquinas. But I would call that a sort of epistemology of sympathetic coherence, as opposed to a more aggressive modern epistemology. So that's one example. Read the book for a lot of the details. But I draw some connections between Aquinas and people like William James, the great American philosopher, who in his own way was a critic of modernity. Anyway, those are some of the deeper waters I'm swimming in there.
We've already tossed around many big words, and there's going to be more coming here as we move into the second part of your book, The Priority of Christ, which focuses on metaphysics. So metaphysics is the study of existence or being. And you suggest that the key revelation when we make Christ the priority of metaphysics is this understanding of God as the non-competitive transcendent. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, of course, it's in some ways the master idea in everything I've ever written. And I got it from Robert Sokolowski, my great philosophical mentor, when I was a kid at Catholic U. And I've just been kind of ringing the changes on that for many years. The idea there is that God, the creator of all things, is not an item within the universe, not playing on the same ontological playing field. So you and I right now, like all finite things, are in competition. If I came to Orlando right now and I tried to sit in your seat, I'd have to push you out of it, right? If I tried to control your thoughts, I'd have to kind of kick your thoughts out and put mine in there. There's a natural competitiveness among finite things because we're competing for the same position on an identical ontological background. Right now, the chair I'm sitting in is kind of pushing against me. I'm pushing against it. And in that tensive equilibrium we call sitting, right? Is this the nature of finite things? But God is not a being among many, as I've said a million times. He's not the supreme being, not the biggest thing around, not the biggest thing on the playing field. Rather, God is otherly other. That's Catherine Tanner's phrase. God is other, but he's other in a way other than typical otherness. You and I are other, but we're in a kind of conventional way other. We're on the same playing field, and you're in this position, I'm in that position. We could be charted together on the same Cartesian coordinate system, right? But God's not like that. God's manner of being is therefore non-competitive. Isaiah can say, Lord, it is you who've accomplished all that we have done. Go back to that statement from Isaiah. I think it's the master text for this idea. How blithely that's stated, but how strange, right? If I were to say, Brandon, it's I who have accomplished all you have done. Well, that's weird. It would be like I'm trying to take you over. In fact, I would be taking you over. But I can say of God, no, it's you who've accomplished all that I have done. I've really done it, but you've accomplished it. Well, that's a good example of how God enters non-competitively into the field. The great image is the burning bush, right? It's on fire but not consumed. The bush is not destroyed by God's proximity. It's made beautiful by God's proximity. That's how God relates to the world. And I think, for me, the Sokolowski insight was like scales falling from my eyes, that suddenly a lot of theology becomes not clear in a sort of bland Cartesian way, but it becomes coherent, everything from creation to the Eucharist. How can we say, the bread and wine have really become the body and blood of Christ, while the appearances remain the same? Key to that is the non-competitive transcendence of God. How do we say that the saint is utterly transparent to God, and yet the saint is fully herself? Or Paul can say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. But yet, does anyone think for a second Paul is less than Paul? That Paul has lost his personality? He's become some sort of automaton or robot? I mean, never. Paul's personality comes roaring out at you through every letter he wrote. Yet he can say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That's the non-competitive transcendence of God. So it's such a master idea.
And here's where we come back to the idea of the priority of Christ, right? Because in Christ, we see his humanity and his divinity coming together, yes, but non-competitively.
Yes, quite right. That's the place. And that was true for Sokolowski. See, what he did go back to him, is he would begin with the incarnation and use that to read creation. Very clever. Usually we go the other way. Like we start with creation and, being in the ordinary sense, and then we try to fit the incarnation into that. He would say, no, begin with the incarnation, and then you get the dynamic that governs creation. Just as the two natures come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion, so God can relate to his world in such a way. Just to take one more step from this book to one of my most recent books on 2 Samuel, I made the argument. Look through all of the Samuel literature. You'll never find God intervening. You know what I'm saying? God doesn't break in and intervene. This story is being told that can be interpreted psychologically, politically, interpersonally, the story of David and his rise and so on. And all the time, the author says, God is accomplishing his purpose. That's how it works.
So again, the master project of the book, The Priority of Christ, is just to sort of counter theological liberalism. And you do that by putting Christ at the center, at the forefront of all these different areas: epistemology, metaphysics, and finally ethics. Let's talk about this final area. In your section on ethics, you delightfully look at ethics through the lives of the saints. You pick out 4 saints in particular. So tell us about your desire here. Why use saints to illustrate ethics, and then why the 4 saints that you chose?
Yeah, well, first of all, I was very influenced by the virtue ethics people. Go back to like Alistair McIntyre and even before him, people like Elizabeth Anscombe and others. The best way to get at ethics is to look at virtuous people in action. That's Aristotle. How do you know what's good? He says, watch the good man. Is that circular reasoning? Not really. It's just the way we go about it commonsensically. What's a good life? Well, who's the best person you know? Okay, now watch him. Watch what he does. That's the good life. And so the virtue ethics is not abstract like Kantian ethics, and even, dare I say, like much of scholastic ethics can be too abstract. Analyzing the act in itself and all this sort of thing. It has its place. But the virtue ethics people want to push beyond really both modern rationalism and the more classical rationalism to say that it's by watching virtuous people in action that we see what's the good life, the form of the good life. I've always been attracted to that. What I did was to extrapolate from that and to the theological realm. Who were the players? Like if you're teaching a kid to play baseball, you could talk about the swing analytically. I remember when I was learning basketball, and we had a really good coach, smart guy, and he was kind of setting us up for the jump shot and showing us, how to configure our elbows to our shoulders and all this stuff. But then he showed us a photograph of John Havlicek, who was a star at the time. I'm dating myself, but he had this beautiful form, of the jump shot, straight back, and the positioning of everything was right. Well, that's a kind of virtue ethics approach. Watch him. We can discuss this abstractly, but watch this great player play. Or, young people won't know what I'm talking about, but Ted Williams, the great player for the Boston Red Sox way back when in the 50s, had what was most people say is like the most beautiful swing. Watch him swing the baseball bat. Ted Williams, by the way, was a skinny guy. It's amazing. You see pictures of him now, this little skinny kid. No, and now our athletes are all kind of buff and muscular. He wasn't at all, but yet, man, he could hit the ball a mile. Why? Because he had this beautiful, graceful, properly proportioned swing. Okay, my point is, watch virtuous people in action. Watch how beautifully and gracefully they move. Imitate them at first. Even if you don't quite get it, do what they do. Like, people, Mother Teresa is one of my 4 saints there, and people would come to her full of romantic, ideas about the poor, and within like 2 days they were devastated. Like, what am I doing here? And I'm in Calcutta, and she would patiently say to them, just do what I'm telling you. I'm not going to explain it to you. It won't make sense. Just do it. Go back to the corny movie, but the Karate Kid, that's famous scene, where the master makes the kid paint the fence and do various things. And the kid's saying, what is the point of all this? What are you making me do this for? And then that beautiful scene, I still think is very striking when he explains, as you were painting the fence, you were actually doing this key move in karate. And as you were digging the hole or whatever it was. And that's the way a great mentor operates, is do it. Just do it. Do it. Watch the master move, imitate him. And then you'll come to inhabit the moral life from the inside. And you won't do it in an abstract, deductive way. You'll do it if you want more inductively. And that's what I'm urging now. By looking at the saints, you'll see what elevated virtues look like. And that's another fine point I'm making there, that the saints exhibit what Thomas called this elevated or supernaturalized form of the cardinal virtues.
So the four saints that you chose are notably all women, and they all, at least religiously, their religious names are all named Teresa. So we have Edith Stein, Saint Teresa Benedicta, who exhibits elevated courage. We have Saint Therese of Lisieux, who exhibits elevated prudence. We have Saint Catherine Drexel, elevated justice. Excuse me, 3 Teresas then, not 4. Yeah. And then finally, Blessed Teresa of Calcutta, soon to be Saint Teresa of Calcutta, who exhibits elevated temperance. Maybe give us a word about each of these 4 women.
Oh my gosh, yeah. The reason I chose the 4, and I've talked about it a number of times, is the great concern about women's ordination in the church. And people make so readily the connection between ordination and power. To have real power in the church, you need to be a priest. And I've always felt that's a silly idea. The priests simply serve the laity. That's our whole purpose. We confect the sacraments, or we administer the sacraments. We teach and preach. Why? To make the laity holy. That's our whole purpose. Who's more important in the church? By far, the laity. And I say that without any hesitation. My whole purpose is to make lay people holy, period. In other words, to make them saints. Now the point. The really powerful people in the church are not priests. They're saints. Who are the most powerful Catholics of the 19th century? Clearly, it seems to me, Bernadette of Lourdes and Therese of Lisieux. By far. More important than Pius IX? Yes, absolutely. Who's the most powerful Catholic of the 20th century? More important than Pius XII, John Paul II? Mother Teresa of Calcutta. By far, absolutely. No question. The most powerful people. So I want to tell women, that sounds a little aggressive, I want to help women see that real power resides in sanctity, not in the priesthood. Now, mind you, priests can be holy. I hope they are. I'm trying to be holy. But the real game is being a saint. I mean, if I were to become a priest, I'm a bishop, but I go to hell, what's the point? You know, I mean, the whole point is to become a saint. So I was trying to make that argument. I didn't make it explicitly, but I was trying to imply that anyway by looking at 4 women saints. And they're wonderful. Of course, each one in her own way is a wonderful exemplar of these things. And the cardinal virtues here, we're looking at, which are justice and temperance and courage and prudence, right? The 4 cardinal virtues. But the Aquinas says that when grace invades you, you don't, it's the burning bush again, those virtues don't disappear, they're transfigured. They take on a whole new luminosity. They're elevated to a high pitch. So I chose each of these saints because each one exemplifies one of the cardinal virtues so elevated. Edith Stein, who's a great hero of mine, you're right, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross being her religious name, exemplifies, as all the martyrs do, elevated courage. So fortitude, one of the great cardinal virtues, courage, which protects justice from external threats. That's a way to understand it. But in the martyr, think of the 4 Mother Teresa sisters just martyred in, was it Yemen a few days ago? Mm-hmm. We're living in an age of martyrs. 20th century, the worst century on record for martyrdom, or best, depending on your perspective. It's not changed much in the 21st century. All the saints exemplify this elevated courage, but the martyrs especially. And that's what I saw in Edith Stein. So much else, too. I delighted in telling those stories. It was my favorite part of the book to write. It's a narrative approach to ethics. Let me narrate the story of the saints, and you'll see their virtues emerging. See, I'm not describing them abstractly, but I'm describing them in a densely narrative way. That's also a mark of a lot of the post-liberals. They don't like thin descriptions. They like thick descriptions. Tolkien laying out his world is giving you a thick description. And in the course of that thick description, you learn a lot about life and about virtue and about the good life, don't you? Tolkien is wagering, watch these characters move. Watch how they react. Watch how they think. So that's the wager now with the saints. Watch them in a thickly described narrative. You'll learn the virtues.
So we've been talking about your book, The Priority of Christ Toward a Post-Liberal Catholicism. Originally, you wrote it in 2007, but it was just re-released in a beautiful hardcover edition. At the end of the book, you say that the book, while academic, it's admittedly, a high-level scholarly book, it ultimately has an evangelical purpose. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, all good theology does. I hope this is good theology. The Summa Theologiae has an evangelical purpose. Augustine's Confessions have an evangelical purpose because they're all meant to announce Jesus Christ. If we just get it stuck in faculty lounges and we're talking about theological method all day, there's something off with that. The church's job and the academic aspect of the church is an aspect of the church, and so its overall purpose is to declare Jesus Christ as Lord. What I'm trying to show in this book is that he's properly Lord of everything. He's Lord of being. He's Lord of the way we know. He's Lord of the way we act. So in that way, the whole book is evangelical. It declares the priority or the lordship of Jesus over every aspect of life.
We're running a special deal on the Priority of Christ. So if you don't already have your copy, head over to wordonfire.org/priority, and you can get the book cheaper there than anywhere else, cheaper than Amazon, cheaper than anywhere else. But this is a limited time special. So if you like what you've heard about the book so far, be sure to head over to wordonfire.org/priority. It's time now for our regular question from our listeners. Today we're going to be hearing from Donald, but if you have a question for Bishop Barron, be sure to visit askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question, and every single episode we pick one to play here on the air. Since our focus is on the priority of Christ, we thought we'd take a question about Christ, and Donald asks about a particular saying from Jesus on the cross. So here's Donald.
My name's Donald from Houston, and I was hoping that you could talk about my God, why have you forsaken me? Thank you so much for all you do. You guys are rock stars.
I appreciate being a rock star. Yeah, it's a great question. And to get the fullest answer, read Hans Urs von Balthasar's Mysterium Pascale, I think is the best treatment of that. But every single theologian has been intrigued by it. Chesterton famously saying that it's as though God becomes an atheist on the cross. What's happening there? I would say the Son, having been sent by the Father down to share our humanity. So though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God a thing to be grasped, but rather emptied himself and became a slave, being born in the likeness of men. He was known to be of human estate. I'm quoting Paul, Philippians now, right? He was known to be of human estate, and it was thus that he humbled himself. Listen now, obediently accepting even death on a cross. For a first century Jew, really anybody in the Roman world, that would have been about as low as you can go. To die on a cross was the most horrific type of torture, involving physical torture, of course, but if you want psychological torture, where did the Son go? The Son went all the way down into God-forsakenness. He went fully into the experience of the sinner, mind you, without becoming a sinner. If he were a sinner, he needed to be saved too. He's not a sinner. Christ is sinless, like us in all things but sin. Nevertheless, Paul can say, on the cross, he became sin for us. What does that mean? It means he entered radically into the experience of the sinner. Now, why? Why? So as to find and embrace even those who had gone to that darkest place. You see, I'm driving it. That's the momentum of the incarnation, is downward to the lowest place. What we hear on the cross is Jesus expressing as powerfully as possible this attitude, this experience of being forsaken by God. Was he forsaken by God? I would say no. I mean, the Son can't be severed from the Father. But does he enter into the experience of being forgiven or forsaken by God in his human nature? Yeah, absolutely. And see, in that, we find salvation. You know somebody, I'll talk to Donald here directly, but everyone listening, you know somebody who's probably in that space or near it, who just really feels at the limit, abandoned by God. Has God been there? Yeah, he's been there. God's been there. You go, listen now, you go running away from God as fully as you possibly can. You're running away from the Father. Where are you going to run? You're going to run right into the arms of the Son. Now, there's Christianity. So the God, my God, why have you abandoned me is very important for our salvation. You run into that space, you run into the arms of the Son. That's Christianity.
Well, thanks again for listening to another episode of the Word on Fire show. I want to remind you again to pick up your copy of the beautiful, elegant new edition of The Priority of Christ. You can get it for a limited time at a huge discount at wordonfire.org/priority. So go ahead and get your copy before that special runs out. Also, later this week on Thursday, March 10th, we're going to be hosting a giveaway where we're giving away 10 copies of the book thanks to the publisher, Baker Academic, who donated them to Word on Fire. So if you want to win a copy, be sure to visit wordonfire.org on Thursday, March 10th. Thanks so much for listening to this episode, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.